They buried an emperor under a toilet, then lied about it for decades. The night Haile Selassie was murdered, guards heard his muffled screams, but no one dared intervene. This is the shocking truth behind the Lion of Judah's brutal end, and the Soviet-backed coup that erased 3,000 years of monarchy. Stick around, the palace doctor's confession changes everything. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, once hailed as the Lion of Judah and defender of African sovereignty, would live his final days not as a sovereign ruler but as a prisoner stripped of dignity, betrayed by the very system he had spent his life upholding. His fall was not an abrupt collapse but a gradual unraveling marked by diplomacy turned fragile. Loyalty decayed into silence, and rebellion cloaked in reformist zeal. In the prime of his leadership during the 1950s and 1960s, Haile Selassie navigated a delicate game of international diplomacy. He wooed both Western and Eastern powers, securing over $100 million from Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow and cultivating ties with Premier Zhou Enlai in China. Yet Ethiopia's reliance on American aid remained his Achilles heel. As the Cold War deepened, the emperor played both sides, and for a time he succeeded. But while he strode global stages as a statesman, the kingdom he left behind festered with unresolved grievances, not least the seething tensions in Eritrea. Haile Selassie's 1962 decision to dissolve the Eritrean Federation and annex it as Ethiopia's 14th province unleashed a tide of armed resistance. The Eritrean Liberation Front, deeply opposed to Ethiopian domination, declared war not only against the government but against rival nationalist factions, plunging the region into chaos. His appointment of Ras Kassa, a man who favored isolationist tactics, proved impotent against the tide of guerrilla warfare. When General Teshome Ergetu was ambushed and eliminated by ELF forces in 1970, the civil war ignited into a relentless fire. The emperor, increasingly out of touch, swung between diplomatic charm and military aggression, yet neither pacified the insurgency nor healed the fracture. The emperor's international stature did little to reverse Ethiopia's internal decay. By the early 1970s, America's shifting priorities, spurred by satellite technology and the fading relevance of the CAG news station in Eritrea, resulted in the reduction of aid. Richard Nixon's administration, unlike its predecessors, began looking to Kenya as a more stable regional ally. Selassie's desperate return to Moscow in 1973 yielded only cold indifference. Leonid Brezhnev delayed their meeting and ultimately ignored the emperor's pleas to halt Soviet weapons supplies to Somalia, Ethiopia's hostile neighbor. Isolated abroad, besieged at home, Selassie's leadership buckled further under the weight of a succession crisis. His intended heir, Crown Prince Asfawasan, suffered a debilitating stroke. By the time the emperor named the prince's son, Prince Zara Yacob, as acting heir, it was too late to secure the dynasty's continuity. Famine became the scythe that severed any remaining reverence the populace had for their monarch. In Tigray and Wallo, as many as 80,000 people perished between 1972 and 1973. The emperor's inaction, his regime's exportation of over 200,000 tons of grain during the famine, and his belated visit to the decimated provinces enraged the nation. The public no longer saw him as the divine father of Ethiopia, but as a distant, cold sovereign prioritizing appearances and alliances over human life. The revolution was no longer a whisper. It was a roar building momentum in the army barracks and among the people. In early 1974, what began as a localized mutiny in Jili Barina escalated into a nationwide upheaval. Soldiers, students, taxi drivers, and teachers all found common cause against a government that had grown fat and deaf. Selassie's reactive appointments, first General Abaye Bebe, then Lij Ndakachu Makoen, failed to placate the rising storm. Even as he shuffled loyalists into key positions, the newly formed military group, the Derg, was already laying the groundwork for a coup. They called for the arrest of top ministers, and when the emperor refused, they marched into Jubilee Palace and detained Prime Minister Aklalu Habtwold and others in Selassie's very presence. That the arrests were carried out in his name was a cruel irony. The emperor, a symbol of unwavering control for decades, now stood powerless as his kingdom crumbled from within. By July 1974, the Derg stepped into the light, no longer the faceless force of whispers and threats. Their slogan, Ethiopia Tictum, or Ethiopia First, became the banner of revolution. Emperor Haile Selassie's titles were systematically stripped. Once celebrated as Negusa Negast, he was now merely Negus. His palace was seized, his church disavowed him, and his nation prepared to erase 3 millennia of monarchic tradition. On September 12, 1974, the emperor was escorted from the national palace like a prisoner. The proclamation of his removal read aloud in the library marked not just the end of his reign, but the symbolic elimination of an empire. What followed was not reform but bloodletting. Mengistu Haile Mariam, rising through the ranks of the Derg with chilling speed, soon displaced General Aman Andam, a moderate who favored negotiation with Eritrea. On November 17, 1974, Mengistu demanded mass executions of imprisoned imperial officials. Aman resisted and paid for it with his life. His defiance ended in a fight at his residence, tanks surrounding his compound, and the general dead amid the rubble of rebellion. With Aman eliminated, Mengistu read out the names of the condemned like a death liturgy. 60 of Ethiopia's most senior leaders were executed in the courtyard of Akaki Central Prison, their bodies buried in shallow, unmarked graves beneath quicklime. It was an orgy of violence that marked the true birth of the Red Terror. Haile Selassie remained under house arrest in Menelik Palace. Gone was the Lion of Judah who once commanded empires. Now he was an old man shadowed by his butler, Eshatu Tekel Mariam, and haunted by the betrayal of a nation. The emperor's death came not as a final act of dignity, but as a grim spectacle of cruelty. On the night of August 27, 1975, Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam was seen pacing outside the emperor's quarters. The next morning, a strange ether-like smell filled the air. Selassie was found dead, his face blue, the pillow beside his head, not beneath it. His personal physician, Professor Asrat Woldeyes, publicly disputed the military's account that the emperor had died from a prostate operation. He had, by all accounts, been in good health. The overwhelming evidence pointed to death by suffocation, his life extinguished in silence and secrecy. Even in death, there was no reprieve. His remains were not honored with a state funeral or sacred rites. Instead, they were hidden under a toilet floorboard in the palace, a grotesque metaphor for how the revolution sought to erase his legacy. The monarchy was abolished in March 1975. Imperial crests, portraits, and titles were removed, scrubbed from buildings, books, and currency. All vestiges of the Solomonic dynasty, which claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, were to be expunged. The dream of divine rule, thousands of years old, ended beneath stone tiles and the boot of revolutionary pragmatism. For decades, the whereabouts of Selassie's body remained shrouded in rumor and secrecy. It wasn't until 1991, after Mengistu's regime fell, that the remains were unearthed. A toilet chamber, never intended as a tomb, became the unlikely crypt of one of Africa's most iconic rulers. 2 years later, a mass grave was uncovered at Akaki prison, confirming the executions ordered in 1974. Not until November 5, 2025 years after his death, was Emperor Haile Selassie finally given a dignified burial. A ceremony was held at Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa. His casket was adorned with lion crests, draped in the green, gold, and red flag of Ethiopia, and thousands gathered to pay their final respects. But the burial, though ceremonial, could not erase the pain or the complex legacy he left behind. For some, Haile Selassie remains a martyr, divine in spirit, betrayed by men of ambition. To others, he was a ruler who overstayed his relevance, whose stubbornness accelerated his kingdom's collapse. But whatever history decides, his end was not a quiet chapter. It was a grim exclamation mark punctuated by muffled cries, the rattling of chains, and the cold hiss of betrayal. His story, from coronation to concealment, stands as one of the most haunting political tragedies of the 20th century. A king not dethroned by battle or invasion, but by the invisible rot of a nation he could no longer command. Was Haile Selassie a visionary ruler undone by time, or a monarch who lost touch with his people? Was his fall the price of pride, or the result of ruthless ambition by those he once trusted? And can a revolution that begins with hope ever justify such cruelty? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe history's darkest truths should never stay buried, subscribe to the channel, because behind every throne is a shadow, and behind every empire, a reckoning.